please welcome Sarah Cahill and Robert Aiki Aubrey Lowe.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Are we sharing oh, we each have a microphone. Great. Yeah. On the way out here, we passed this setup with some plants, and maybe we can begin there. Tell us just what's on the stage.
What I have on the stage is my modular synthesizer, and the plants are there because I'm using a little piece of hardware called a MIDI Sprout, which is produced by this collective from Philadelphia called Data Garden. And, excuse me, what it does is it uses sensors that you attach to plants, and it reads the biorhythms of the plant. Fed into the box, it converts it to a MIDI signal, and so I'm using the MIDI signal to control aspects and parameters of what's happening within the patch on the synthesizer.
Do you choose particular plants? Do different plants have different data?
I would imagine they do. I wouldn't know for sure. This is actually my first time using it. We'll see what happens.
You've played in metal bands and all kinds of different kinds of music, and I'm sure that this is a very, very different thing. I wonder how. I'm curious about how people listen to your music, different kinds of music, because this is involves so much subtlety on a kind of micro level, listening to data from plants. So can you tell us about that? I mean, maybe about how the musical process is different, the pacing.
Well, I guess the process would be different in the way that when I play with groups that have an established song structure, it is that. And generally, my practice as a solo artist lends itself to spontaneous music or improvisation. So yeah, I mean, really, I guess that's it. And it has more to do with trusting my own intuition and letting it happen.
And also, the audience, listens in a very concentrated way.
Sometimes.
Who is your ideal listener?
I don't necessarily think that I do have an ideal listener. Whoever wants to listen is more than welcome to.
And are you vocalizing also? There's some vocals involved.
I will be utilizing my voice. Mm-hmm.
There was a really fascinating quote somewhere online that I wanted to ask you about, where you say, the sensitivity of analog modular systems echoes the organic nature of vocal expression. So could you explain that a little bit?
Well, I feel that modular synthesizers are extremely sensitive and organic instruments, and I genuinely feel that it's a misconception that it is a machine and it's cold. Modular synthesizers are based around voltage. It's all electricity, and as humans, we are made up of electricity. And so it becomes this thing when playing a modular synthesizer, the instrument itself is kicking out this electricity, and you are feeding it back in by your movement and gesture and patching cables and turning knobs. And the fact that they are so sensitive as instruments, within a patch piece, you could touch one knob on one module, move it a millimeter, and it will completely change the architecture of the patch. So it is an extremely organic machine, like humans.
When I think of modular synthesizers, which I admit isn't that often, I think of people like Robert Moog and Don Buchla and instruments that have been around for a long time. Are these new or old or a mix?
They're all new modules. There's a format that was that came into existence in the mid-1990s. This fellow Dieter Doepfer from Germany created a format which was 3U modular size, or 3 units, like you would have in a rack in, say, outboard gear in a studio. And so basically what he started doing was producing modules that were smaller than older Buchla or Moog or Serge modules that were doing the same sorts of things, and all based within the realm of control voltage. Was that it? Yeah, so it's all new.
When did you start using modular synthesizers?
I guess about 6 or 7 years ago.
And how did it happen?
It was due to the fact that in producing solo work and using my voice as the springboard for all the work that I was doing sonically, I would utilize other instrumentation, whether it be a guitar, whether it be pieces of percussion, and then I got to the point where I started using hardwired synthesizers, and in my estimation, and like I was sort of saying in that quote, the organic nature of the synthesizer synthesis, I think, is closer to how allophones work, how the human voice works, than any other instrument.
What are allophones?
Allophones, just like vocalizations. And because of the fact that, say, for example, you take someone like Harry Partch, who was creating instruments that, he had a 41 note scale that would sort of get in between the cracks of the Western scale, or the 12-tone scale.
So divided the octave into 41 parts. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I started using synthesizers more often in performance and recordings with my voice. And I truly felt that as I went along, starting with hardwired synthesizers and then semi-modular systems, the modular synthesizer best echoed the human voice, and also the way that the two interact and the way that they couple, I think, makes the most sense, at least in my mind. And so that's how I landed there.
Interesting. Can people come up and look at it afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You've been here for a couple of days working with the wonderful Myer Constellation system. I wonder what that's like. Is it great?
It is. It's a little it's a little daunting. It's thinking about spatialization and how to move sound through the air can be a lot of work. So I definitely simplified it, and I'm only using 5 channels, and then through the system, it's been programmed so the sound will sort of be moving throughout the room.
Oh, great, great.
But yeah, it's nice.
Liz Kime backstage told me that she had seen the film A Spell to Ward Off the Darkness, which just came out a couple of months ago, and she said it was really mesmerizing, and your performance was mesmerizing. How did that film come about?
The film was made by 2 artists, Ben Russell and Ben Rivers, and Ben Russell and I were colleagues and mutual fans of each other's work. Ben mainly works in the medium of film, and we had actually done a small trip together where we were doing performances. I was doing solo performances for voice, treated voice, and he was doing duet performances with another artist, Joe Grimm, that was 2 film projectors broadcasting light onto light-sensitive electronics that were being manipulated by Joe. And on this trip, he and I had talked about collaborating in some way, and what that was hadn't revealed itself to us. But in the meantime, Ben had met another filmmaker called Ben Rivers from the UK, who's living in and still lives in London. And they had decided that they would make a piece of work together. And within that, they wanted to collaborate with me as the featured human within the film for very specific reasons, and because of the idea of the film, which essentially poses the question of what is utopia and how do humans live in the world. So they approached me and asked if I would be involved with the project, and so we spent a year working on the film.
Did it involve acting? I mean, did you have to work on acting?
It was acting. I was definitely engaged in actions that I would not normally do. I guess I would call them actions more than acting. And it was not a documentary. It was sort of an unfiction. It was a constructed work utilizing real experiences. So yeah, I did. It was difficult to do some of the actions, but yeah, they were acted.
What inspires you in your vocal work? Where does it? What are its origins?
Oh dear. I don't know if I could necessarily pin anything down. I like to have my ears open as much as possible. Globally, traditional music's from all over the place. I'm drawn to, whether it be Central African or Middle Eastern or Indian or Norwegian or Icelandic or Brazilian, what have you. Music from northern Japan. It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
Sonically, I guess. And other than that, I don't know. I feel like my work is based in environment and circumstance more than I could say that there was one particular form of music or artist or film or painting that I was drawn to that inspired me to do such things. It really has to do with whether I stubbed my toe that morning,
Yeah. Does performing involve entering into an altered state for you?
I think the state alters itself no matter whether I want it to or not. I'm fine to let go and let it be what it is.
Was it a big transition for you to go from performing with people in groups to being solo on stage?
I mean, it was a transition. I don't know how. Personally, I don't feel that it was so drastic because of the sorts of things that are inspirational. It was something that was very nice and actually kind of liberating to be able to produce work on my own terms, on my own time. So yeah.
And you play lots of different instruments, so that must have. Anyway,
they make a racket. I don't know if I would say I'm playing them. I think maybe they're playing me.
Where did the name Lycans come from?
Lycans came from, I guess the impetus for making solo work came from this idea of spontaneous composition wherein the viewer as well as myself witness the complete evolution of a particular piece. Lichens are the oldest living organism on the planet. I had a lichenologist come to one of my shows a few years ago, this German fellow, who told me about this lichen that was under a glacier in the Arctic that was over 1 million years old and still alive and still growing. And that was something that resonated with me. Of course, that was after I had already decided on the moniker. But this sort of idea of the fact that lichens live symbiotically in places where they maybe not necessarily would otherwise if they were any other sort of plant life. They adapt. And so taking that idea and adapting to particular circumstances in the middle of a live performance, if something goes awry or in a way that I don't think that it hadn't considered that it would, then I'd play into that and let it go where it's going to go.
Mm. Are you going to use lichen in your work with plants?
That would be nice. I actually hadn't thought about that, but it would. It's kind of obvious.
Yeah. I'm a pianist, and I recently recorded, my next album is called Patterns of Plants, and a Japanese composer who wrote pieces about the voices of plants using something called a plantron. You hook it up to the leaves of plants and pick up the bioelectric fluctuations. But it's all notated music, and in the way I was raised, it's all about sort of refining that interpretation of the notated music for years and years and years, and finally sort of getting it right and recording it. And which makes me kind of mystified by the idea of recording an improvisation, that you go into a studio and you improvise, and then it's there it is, sort of frozen in time in a way. And I admire that so much. I mean, just getting spontaneity on record. But is it? I mean, it must be liberating.
I think so. It makes a lot of sense to me to be able to document a particular point in time, a moment. And I think sometimes you have really fresh ideas in that moment, and then when you try to recreate those ideas, it's sort of like memory. Everything that we remember is not actually how it happened. That, like, some moment happens and you said, oh, well, this one time this happened this particular way, and it's pretty close, but the way you remember it is not exactly right. So being able to have that moment recorded, I think, is nice.
And you think of all the great guitar solos in rock and roll, and the improvisations in jazz, which we always think of as that's the way it goes.
Right.
But it was actually a spontaneous improvisatory moment.
Yeah, it's alive.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. Any questions from the audience? Yeah. Hi.
In a lot of your track titles, I think it's Esperanto that you use. Track titles. I'm just wondering why you use Esperanto as track titles a lot of the time.
I decided there were 2 albums that I used Esperanto on, and those were the first 2 synthesizer records that I released. And I felt that the synthesizer was the most universal instrument, and using a universal language, I thought, just made sense. That's where that came from. And it was sort of, I'd recorded a bunch of material around the same time, and so the selections that I used on each of the records. It was sort of like a part 1 and a part 2, and that's where that came from.
How much is Esperanto spoken now? I know there's a society.
I think there are about 60,000 speakers in the world,
Oh.
something like that. I don't speak it. I just like it.
Question? Yeah.
I was curious if, as a part of your practice, understanding that modular synthesis doesn't lie in a realm of permanence, that every time you patch new things, it's always a different idea or a different subject, or like you said, based on whatever environment you're in is what's going to affect what you make. And I was curious if, as a part of your practice, do you either, do you do it as a, I wouldn't say traditionally, but do you record almost everything that you make in order to always have that documented evidence of what you have made? It won't be the same the next time.
Did everybody hear that question?
No? He was asking whether or not I recorded everything I did due to the fact that modular synthesizers, you won't achieve the same result every time. And the answer is no. I probably should, but I don't. I wish I did, but I'm lazy.
In the world of Eurorack, how do you decide which modules to use? Because it's such like this big universe of possibility. You know, I find myself just completely kind of overwhelmed, you know, with all these new modules constantly coming out. I mean, how do you just fit it all into, you know, how do you decide what to use?
Oh, that's a good question.
The question is, how do you decide which modules to use?
Yeah, there are so many modules and so many companies producing modules now in this particular format. I am of the mind, I was actually asked a question earlier in an interview about large versus small systems. And I don't ever consider large systems because a large part of my practice is the fact that I travel and I do performances and I need to be mobile. And so because of that, every module I put into the system is very considered. I have the luxury of being an associate at a modular synthesizer shop in Brooklyn where I do consultations and help people put systems together. So I really get to try out a lot of things, which is nice. But before that, I would read up on whatever module was coming out, and whatever piqued my interest, I would just jump, get it, see if I could actually utilize it for what I needed it for. And if that was the case, great. If not, then I would sell it and get another module. I feel like I do things in a very particular way, and I know what pleases my ear sonically, and due to that fact, I will definitely shy away from certain things as opposed to others, because I know I have reading up on things that I have a ballpark idea of what it is and what it does, and that's how I decide before, and now I
That's great to work in a place where you can try things out.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful.
it's definitely helpful.
So is this the first time you've used the MIDI Sprout system?
It is.
And can you tell us about that and how you developed a relationship with MIDI Sprout?
Well, I'm in the process of developing a relationship with the MIDI Sprout.
Tell us again what MIDI Sprout is.
MIDI Sprout is a piece of hardware that was developed by a collective in Philadelphia called Data Garden. And they've actually just done recently a Kickstarter to gain funds to mass produce this piece of gear. And what it does, it has 2 sensors that you can attach to plants. You can attach it to the human body, and it will read the biorhythms and biofeedback, and it feeds it into the box where it's converted into a MIDI signal, and then you can use that MIDI signal out of the box into a MIDI interface for a modular synthesizer or a laptop computer or what have you, and that information will influence the architecture of the sound.
And this is the first time you've used it?
It is. I was only able to receive it from the folks that do Data Garden a few days before I left for my trip, and I got the flu, and I was very sick a few days ago, so I didn't have the wherewithal to I was sleeping.
Yeah.
And so now here it is. We'll see what happens.
And where did these plants come from?
Somewhere in the building.
There's another one. There's another one. Any more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you are familiar at all, either of you, with a group called the Damagomi?
No.
Which one?
The Damagomi, I just heard about it literally yesterday, so you guys talking about plants and making music with plants. I guess they're a cult that was local, like kind of a new age cult throughout the 20th century that focused on getting music from plants. So, and some local filmmakers are in the process of doing a documentary about them, actually.
Oh, wow. When you say throughout the 20th century, from the 40s, 50s on?
I think it was the areas that they're focusing on in the film. There was an event in Big Sur that they're going to recreate in the 20s, and then one in Marin in the 50s. And then there was one more in San Francisco in the 60s, I believe,
Wow.
or early 70s. But I'll try to touch base with you after
Yeah,
the
that
show.
would be great. I'd be really curious.
Yeah.
The 1920s seems very early.
Yeah, they weren't doing the kind of synthesis stuff, but they did wind up using modular synth in the 50s and, and the 70s. So. But,
Yeah. One more question before we stop? Yeah.
I was lucky to work with Rob last year.
Hi, Frank.
But I still have to ask the question, why analog?
Oh,
Why analog is the question.
well, actually, a lot of the modules produced in the Eurorack format now are actually digital. So it's an analog signal path, but I actually don't prescribe to the idea of only analog. It's all based on voltage. I'm more concerned with that. As far as digital, if you mean, say, like computer music, like out of a laptop or something, I just don't know how to use that stuff. And also, I will say, it's the physical nature of it is very important to me. Like the tactility of plugging in the cables and turning the knobs, and just the physicality of everything, because you put yourself into it and you're completely involved in what's happening. Whereas I feel like tapping a couple keys and looking at a screen is not quite as engaging for me. I'm just not as compelled.
Great. Well, thank you.
Well,
Looking
very
forward to your
welcome.
performance.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.